Before this video begins, I'm playing this version of the game. Yeah, I know. Look, I'm playing this version since it's actually available for purchase, and it has some quality of life features that I enjoy, such as an autosave, checkpoints in the missions, a weapon wheel, and a GPS system for your minimap. I also don't mind the art style changes, even though I do think the vibe of the original was slightly lost in translation. Yes, this version in many ways is not as good as the original version. In fact, this might be the worst of the remastered PS2 trilogy. Even on higher end machines such as mine, performance is inconsistent. Many songs were removed, and there are a number of bugs that didn't exist prior. However, I personally prefer the quality of life features the definitive edition added, so that was the version I decided to play for my playthrough. Not to mention, the original version that was delisted from Steam low-key also kinda sucked. And I don't really feel like emulating stuff unless I have no other choice. I, however, did also play through the initial Los Santos portion on the original, just so I can make some proper comparisons. With that all being said, is the definitive edition the best way to play the game nowadays? No. The best way to experience this game is probably through emulation at this point, given the issues that I mentioned prior, and also the fact that you can mod the fuck out of this game to your liking, and probably even add in a lot of the quality of life features that I mentioned earlier. If you have the option, take that route. If not, the definitive edition is an okay way to play through this, even though the remaster itself is not up to the standard that these titles honestly deserve. So there you go, and hey, if you don't like the fact that I'm playing this version of the game for this video, be like CJ. So anyways, even with me playing the inferior version of this game, San Andreas still kicks ass. Given the context of everything that I just played, from the first two top-down games to the 3D entries, this is hands down the best time I've had with the entire series up until this point, and I'm even including when I played a shit ton of GTA 5 and online back when it launched in 2013. Clearly, I wasn't the only one who enjoyed this game though, because since this game was released in October of 2004, the game has adored audiences and critics alike. It has won a shit ton of awards, and by 2011, it had sold over 27.5 million copies. This game would go on to being the highest selling game of the PS2, get ported to nearly everything under the sun, create a shit ton of memes, and also one of gaming's biggest controversies with the hot coffee mod. The game's legacy is pretty familiar to anybody who's been gaming within the past 20 years, so you're probably familiar with it by now. So I wanted to take the opportunity in this video to share with you guys my experience, because before this video, I've never actually played this game from start to finish before. This is our next stop with our journey through the Grand Theft Auto series. So, without further ado, this is my review of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas.
Oh shit, here we go again.
2004 saw the 6th generation of consoles continue to have their catalogs filled out with some spectacular looking games for the time, including Ninja Gaiden, Far Cry, and Burnout 3 Takedown. The end of the year wrapped up with some more graphical powerhouses with the likes of Halo 2, Half-Life 2, and Metal Gear Solid 3. Presentation-wise, this put San Andreas in a bit of an awkward position, as sonically it could easily compete and even in some case gap what most of the releases had going on, but on the visual side of things, there was still a little bit to be desired. Like, I think the game looks fine and all, but compared to other games that I've mentioned, and even some earlier games in that generation such as Kingdom Hearts or Final Fantasy X-2, it's a little bit behind the curve at this point. I will say, compared to Vice City, however, San Andreas does take a couple steps forward in regards to how this game presents itself in both departments. Graphically speaking, we see a departure from the bright neon signs and sandy beaches of the previous game and are taken to the GTA universe's depictions of the southwestern parts of the United States, focusing primarily on the southern parts of California and Nevada. In part of this game's map, you still see similar neon extravagance, but in others you see the grimy underside of society with the rustic colors and broken down conditions of buildings you might expect. This makes seeing the bright signs of your local Cluck and Bell stand out to the player as a point of interest, not unlike how you might feel from a drunken night out in the town in real life. That's not even getting into the new shops dotted around the map. Not all of which you can go into, but there's some pretty funny signs here and there for people to read. Hell, I think I spent like 10 minutes or so in this convenience store just reading all the euphemisms in these random objects scattered around the place. The accenting of the environment in this game makes the more urban parts of the map feel like they've been never more lived in before. Which brings us to our characters. Now look, obviously the textures are different than the original game with the remastered version, and since the definitive edition kind of standardized the art style a bit, it doesn't really allow people to see the improvements over the 3 games, but trust me, comparing the originals back to back to back, it's definitely noticeable. Something that should be incredibly evident, however, is the work done in the animation, character model, and cinematography departments. Let's start with the animations. While you have the occasional quirks such as the weird things characters have going on with their necks, or the ever-present mystery of how Ryder is able to levitate his blunt, everything else is a pretty stark improvement over what we saw in the previous game. In Vice City, the animations weren't bad by any means, but these characters are so much more expressive this time around with the way they move, and in many cases offer some great character moments or funny gags that weren't present before, such as Woozie constantly having issues with things because of his blindness. Or how about the iconic scene where CJ first gets introduced to Big Smoke, who tries to beat him with a bat? The real updates to the animations come during the gameplay, however. Melee combat, for example, looks significantly less janky this time around. There are also the absolute tons of new animations that CJ has going on for him alone when it comes to doing things such as lifting weights, eating food, playing basketball, or even putting on a little bit of Riz. Speaking of CJ, what better person to talk about when it comes to the character models? So I think I can pretty confidently say that CJ probably has one of the highest number of different possible character models from any game from the 6th generation of consoles, outside of something like World of Warcraft, I guess. CJ has so many different hairstyles, clothing, and tattoo options, and that's not even getting to the different things that you can do to alter his body style. Plus, the improvements to NPCs honestly have to be noted too, especially when it comes to the women models. I don't know what it was, but man, the female character models look significantly weirder than the men in 3 and Vice City, so it's good to see that they at least close the gap a little bit in that regard. Finally, when it comes to the cinematography, they continued in the direction that Vice City was going, but since everything has just been scaled up to a much larger degree, these moments benefit even more from the way they're shot. Like this scene where CJ is talking to Sweet in the middle of a gunfight, or how about when he jumps out of a fucking plane to land on another one? It's honestly some pretty awesome stuff. But not everything is awesome. There are a couple of things, graphically speaking, that do happen in both the original game and the remaster that do hold this game back slightly. The two main complaints that I have to do with the pop-in and the low-resolution textures when viewing things at a distance. Now, these issues aren't too dissimilar to what we saw in both 3 and Vice City, since I encountered both of those things in those two games. However, since San Andreas provides the players with far more space to play around in, with way longer lines of sight, and allows the use of vehicles that not only can move much faster, but also travel way further into the sky than ever before, these issues are far more apparent than the previous two games. It's especially more noticeable in the urban environments, and it most certainly wasn't a deal breaker for me, but it did happen often enough to be noted. Now, the audio, on the other hand, is pretty much an upgrade across the board. Well, except for the soundtrack, sadly. Like, don't get me wrong, this soundtrack kicks ass. You got songs from artists such as Public Enemy, Slick Rick, Big Daddy Kane, Cypress Hill, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Faith No More, Danzig, Living Colour, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, and even Boyz II Men. These all do a great job of capturing what was going on in the world of hip-hop, alternative rock, and R&B in the early 90s, and I think there are some great additions. You also have some artists such as Willie Nelson, Heart, Kiss, Guns N' Roses, Leonard Skinner, The Who, and Hank Williams that obviously don't really represent the era, but do add some variety, as having some oldie stations does give the game some more added depth. That being said, I don't feel like this soundtrack fully captures the vibe of the early 90s like how Vice City's did with the 80s. I feel like there are some notable genres and songs missing that you can't really think of the 90s without. Look, all I'm saying is if Vice City could get Billie Jean, San Andreas should have gotten Smells Like Teen Spirit. Also, again, the soundtrack is worse in the definitive edition for notable cuts from artists such as Ozzy Osbourne, Tom Petty, James Brown, Rage Against the Machine, and probably worst of all, the removal of Tupac and one of NWA's songs, which, given the game's setting, it just kind of feels wrong by not having these two artists in. Other than my minor complaints about the soundtrack, the game's audio is pretty damn good. The commercials and talk show segments are still hilarious. Hell, you can even have full-on conversations with people on the street this time around too. I mean, they don't really have much to say, but these interactions can still be somewhat funny. And of course, the voice acting in this game is again top-notch. You've got plenty of rappers making cameos such as Game, Ice-T, and Big Boy that take on a pretty prominent roles. But then you have some stars like Chris Penn, Peter Fonda, Charlie Murphy, James Woods, and the fucking GOAT Samuel Jackson. What else can you say other than that this game continues the trend that Rockstar has set with the two previous games of having some top-notch voice performances, which I think goes a really long way in coming together to help create one of the best groups of characters and overall greatest stories that Rockstar has ever produced. To describe the story of San Andreas is quite a tall order when compared to going over the narratives for any other GTA game up until this point. The first game had nothing but nameless and faceless interactions with no real notable plot. The second game's NPCs were nothing more than caricatures, and again, the story was a bit of a nothing burger. 3 had a different cast of characters in an actual story, but also a silent protagonist that left most interactions stilted, and the events that were actually plot-centric were a little too few and far between. Vice City had a pretty memorable cast of characters, a likable voice protagonist, and a decent enough story, but the game doesn't really try to be anything more than that. Just an entertaining experience. San Andreas takes that entertainment value and amps it up to an even higher degree by creating some absolutely hilarious situations and pieces of dialogue, but also some high-octane and dramatic segments that easily eclipse anything that we've seen in this series so far. This game executes a setting that shows how many of the different people in this world make their way of life in rather over-the-top ways, while also highlighting some real-world trials that plagued the early parts of the decade. More than anything else, San Andreas provides a much more character-focused story with an excellent cast that we spend a much larger amount of time with. And while many of them do exhibit a particular trope or stereotype, some of them also represent different ideologies that are explored with how they interact with one another in a way that does not beat you over the head or even come off as plainly obvious unless you stop and think about them. Now, when it comes to the plot structure, San Andreas, for as much more of a nuanced game as it is, still shares a lot of the DNA with the 2 previous titles. You will still be given missions that progress in something of a similar style to a quest chain-like fashion for the many NPCs that you meet across this game's world. These missions, in the grand scheme of things, aren't always the most plot relevant, but provide some solid character building moments and gameplay interactions that all lead up to the more pivotal story important segments. And you could probably make the claim that San Andreas is pretty much the same game plot-wise as Vice City, but just take out the Goodfellas and Scarface references to Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society. And yeah, there probably is some truth to that to an extent. However, I think San Andreas does a couple of things different that really elevates the storytelling in this game far beyond what we've seen for any of the previous GTA games. I think the easiest way of explaining how this all plays out is to kind of break this game down act by act to discuss exactly what is being shown to us. So yeah, obviously, spoilers incoming. I consider Act 1 of the game to be the initial Los Santos portion. This is where we are introduced to our main characters. You play as Carl Johnson, better known as CJ, a former resident of Los Santos who had left the city in an attempt to separate himself from being another product of his environment, one run amok by corrupt authority figures, drug abuse, and gang violence. CJ, living in Liberty City at the time, decides to return home after receiving news of his mother's death at the hands of a rival gang during a drive-by shooting. Upon returning home, the situation looks to be worse than it's ever been before, as the neighborhood in which he grew up in has fallen into a state of disarray, with many people that CJ knew from his previous time in Los Santos having become victims of either gang-related murders, addiction to hard drugs, or under the thumb of someone who is exploiting them for their own personal gain. The latter of those 3 is something that CJ is immediately faced with upon his return home, as he is framed for the homicide of a police officer by a few corrupt cops that look to use CJ to further their influence and power as they undermine the law. This is a setup that sees CJ attempt to keep his family not just together, but alive, and see what he can do to make sure that the people that he cares about don't become another statistic in the unfortunate world that they live in. Now let me just say that CJ is easily the best protagonist that we've seen in the series up until this point, and honestly, he might actually just be the overall best protagonist that Rockstar has ever produced. He provides an excellent lens for the players to see the world through as he re-experiences old areas and becomes reacquainted with previous characters. He has the charisma and moments to be funny, persuasive, or even a bit cocky, but also isn't afraid to be aggressive or demanding if the situation calls for it. Underneath it all, though, he's got a good head on his shoulders and a ton of compassion for those that he cares about. He makes for a great protagonist in this diamond in the rough style portion of the game, but that is also a large part thanks to how he deals with other characters. First, let's start with our primary antagonist, Officer Frank Tenpenny, the corrupt cop that is framing CJ. Now, throughout the game, he is a thorn in CJ and his friend's side, constantly snooping around, forcing CJ to do his bidding, threatening those close to him, and taking advantage of as many other people as he can in any given situation. That's the obvious stuff that is clearly presented to the player. Now, why I think these two provide a pretty good foil to one another is because of the power dynamic involved. Yes, it is a story that has been told before, with a corrupt authority figure exploiting the good-intentioned labor of someone with less than fortunate circumstances. However, there is one small thing that Tenpenny does that really does make him into a very effective villain. And that's the sort of way that he tries to relate with CJ on a personal level in the only way that he thinks he really can: their race. Just looking at some of the speech patterns that Tenpenny occasionally uses as he switches from trying to intimidate CJ into trying to empathize with him on the one thing that he thinks he can is honestly pretty damn slimy, and it goes a long way into making him an intentionally unlikable villain. He will occasionally change his cadence or word choice when talking with CJ to be almost buddy-buddy with him to relate with him on some sort of personal level, even though their allegiances, ideologies, and intentions couldn't be further apart. This takes the typical corrupt cop versus well-intentioned person from unfortunate circumstances dynamic that we see in a lot of other stories, ones that typically do involve some sort of racial commentary, and adds another dimension on top of things that I don't think we really see get explored thoroughly enough. What I like about this, too, is how subtle it all is. Rockstar could have easily had a scene where CJ and his friends are calling Tenpenny out for turning his back on black people. Or really, they could have just made this character a different race entirely and had a pretty standard dynamic. And I think that still would have made for a pretty decent story. But the nuance and subtlety to these interactions really go to show that Rockstar aren't just sitting there spoon-feeding a message to their players, and are instead asking them to think critically about these characters and just what makes this guy such a total bastard. It's really great. A lot of the other side characters also have these really interesting dynamics with CJ too. Next, let's talk about his siblings, Sweet and Kendall, who really couldn't be more opposed to one another. First, we have Sweet, CJ's older brother. Sweet is seen as the leader of the Grove Street families, a primarily African-American street gang that feuds with rival gangs such as the Ballas, and the two Mexican-fronted gangs, being the Los Santos Vargos and the Barrios Los Aztecas. Not unlike the type of gang warfare commonly found around California in the early 90s. Sweet, being the leader of the Grove Street, essentially is a personification for all of their ideals. They will not bend towards the recent trends of other gangs, such as drug distribution, because of their desire to take care of the family, but are still not above other crimes ranging from vandalism to murder. Sweet is, at first, very standoffish with CJ, seeing him as someone who abandoned the family after the death of their younger brother, where Sweet then picked up the slack to take care of their mother and watch out for their younger sister. He was able to keep the family afloat, doing the only thing that he was ever able to do up to that point, and that was by partaking in gang-related activities, which ironically enough also serves as the way that the family keeps fighting trouble. Eventually, the two start to warm up to each other again after CJ spends some time helping out Grove Street, and they rekindle their brotherly relationship. But there always seems to be an edge of both of them holding back their true feelings about the situation that they're in from one another. Kendall could really not be more opposed to Sweet when it comes to their ways of thinking. She wants absolutely nothing to do with the gang stuff, and sees it as something that is ultimately going to get them all killed. She routinely gets on Sweet's ass, and to a lesser extent CJ's, about constantly making what she believes to be poor or unnecessary decisions that are doing more harm than good. She is also romantically involved with another important character, Caesar, a high-ranking member of the Aztecas. Now, there is some obvious tension between the Grove Street families and the various Los Aztecas, some of them being racially charged. That means that Sweet, and again to a lesser extent CJ, don't approve of this relationship. However, while Caesar doesn't interact much with Sweet, he does with CJ, and we actually see that their prejudice was completely unjustified, as Caesar is someone who genuinely cares for Kendall and is willing to do what he can to help CJ out by protecting her and also revealing some information that exposes two people who CJ thought he could trust. These two people are fellow Grove Street members, Ryder and Big Smoke. Ryder is a bit of a combative member of the gang who seems to be a little bit more on the selfish side of things, often having missions that seem to exist to either benefit himself or stroke his own ego. He routinely taunts CJ by calling him a busta when he doesn't do particular things in almost an elitist-like way to claim that he's a poser of sorts. Big Smoke has got a bit of an interesting parallel to CJ too. See, he actually lives a little bit of ways away from Grove Street and is often doing stuff on his own, and it almost feels like he doesn't really want to be a part of the hood anymore and would rather just leave like CJ had successfully done. I bet before clicking on this video, you didn't expect a somewhat nuanced character analysis for someone named Big Smoke, but hey, here we are. And you know, I could go further about some of the side characters and how they are all trapped in this vicious cycle that is perpetuated by where they live, such as the minor character Big Bear turning his back on his former gang because of his addiction to crack, or how OG Loke was pushed by the other members of Grove Street to go to college and make something more of his life, but the gangster lifestyle infatuated him and he ended up going to jail because of it. What I'm essentially trying to say is, just with the first act alone, we get so many different characters that have opposing viewpoints about the idea of organized crime. Where the previous two games sort of glamorize organized crime, San Andreas takes a much more critical lens to it and shows how it affects a bunch of different people in different ways, and I respect the game for going that route. The second act of the game has CJ almost take part in a fish out of water story, as well as rising up to heights he never thought possible before as he travels through the countryside of San Andreas, as well as the cities of San Fierro and Las Venturas. This time around, most of the character interactions show CJ just aligning himself with some new potential allies that will help him along the way, and are often played a little bit more for entertainment value rather than offering some sort of commentary on a greater topic. Take for example Truth, he's just a drugged out hippie that helps you from time to time. Or how about the RC collector Nerd Zero, who might have some of the most infuriating missions in this game. Or how about the return of Catalina from GTA 3, who was revealed to be Caesar's cousin. You have a whole questline with her where you commit various crimes, much like the opening of GTA 3, and when you eventually break her heart, she falls for this guy. Holy shit, that's Claude! And they even kept him mute. Man, that is really funny. This sort of implies that the events of GTA 3 are entirely CJ's fault, which is kind of interesting to think about. Some other characters from the series show up here too, such as Rosenberg, the pencil-necked, coke-addicted lawyer from Vice City. He actually has a questline where he not only recalls stuff about Tommy Vercetti, but also interacts with Salvatore Leone from GTA 3 as well. This is one of my favorite questlines in the game in all honesty, and I think it serves as a great way to add some continuity to the PS2 trilogy. Act 2 still does have a couple of interesting ideas to consider though, such as how the interactions with Salvatore Leone and Woozie create this sort of parallel between the street gangs of Los Santos to the much larger criminal organizations such as the Mafia and the Triads. There are also the interactions with Mike Toriano, the government agent who's also the head of the Loco Syndicate that has been supplying the streets of San Andreas with a surplus of cocaine, while also manipulating CJ into doing some jobs for him under the promise that he will release his brother Sweet from prison. Which is another interesting dynamic to the story at large. Given the common rumor of the time of the government supplying the streets with drugs, I think this is a really good play on that. The real driving force behind Act 2 is CJ surrounding himself with a group of people that he can trust and building up a name for himself to protect those people, as well as save his brother Sweet from prison. This act has him investing in businesses, even going all the way up to a casino to gain wealth basically thought unimaginable before. It's almost like a transformative instance for CJ, as now he is the leader of the group of ragtag misfits, and his confidence increases, allowing him to accomplish things he never thought possible, which all culminates when we get our revenge on Ryder and a large part of the Loco Syndicate. Finally, we have Act 3, which sees us make our return to Los Santos. Arriving back in the starting area of the game kinda gives us this weird nostalgic feeling. It's almost like after leaving a childhood home and coming back there years after the fact in a completely different context. Like, you're somewhere different completely in life, and that chapter of time has closed for you. It's sort of a similar feeling to that. It almost feels like that we've outgrown this area, since at the beginning of the game, we were struggling to just tag random places around the city, and now we're operating our own casino, where in the beginning, we were barely surviving encounters with our handguns, and now we're mowing down platoons of the military with high caliber firearms. Where we walked into our neighborhood with nothing but a dirty wife beater and an old pair of jeans, now we have the nicest clothing money can buy and are decked out completely in tattoos. Sweet, upon being released from prison, notices the change in CJ immediately and is appalled, feeling betrayed once again. To Sweet, it's not about getting results. It's about doing what he believes is the right thing, even if committing crimes is all that he actually knows. And no matter how CJ tries to spin that his actions were for the betterment of the family, Sweet does not buy into it. The next quests have us reclaiming gang territory previously lost in missions that we basically already did nearing the beginning of the game. Early on in the game, this was seen as a big win for Grove Street, but now it just doesn't. Now it feels like we're just wasting our time. This sort of parallels what I just went over about us outgrowing the area, as the player will probably realize that they're just kind of doing the same things over again and question why they're even doing it. Well, in a way, CJ is questioning that too. The answer for why CJ decided to go through with it is because of the respect he has for his brother and his desire to still keep the family together, even if it goes against what he truly thinks is best. This all culminates with Tenpenny being put on trial for his crimes, but being released after a lack of evidence sending the city into a riot. This is then followed by a showdown with Big Smoke, who confirms to CJ that he did let a lot of this stuff go to his head as he wanted a better life for himself. And then after a car chase with Tenpenny, he gets into an accident right outside of Grove Street. And while our main characters contemplate finishing him off, they decide not to instead show the final capstone of them beginning to overcome many of the lessons that they had been nurtured with by what they were being surrounded by. The game ends on a surprisingly happy ending for a story that covers these topics, and, you know, I'm pretty happy with it. So yeah, that was the story of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Now, I occasionally see some criticism thrown at this game that many of the characters are just stereotypes and that it downplays certain ideas like institutionalized racism, but I personally don't agree with that assessment. It's true, this game doesn't have CJ walk up to the camera and give a 3-minute speech about why racism is bad. And yes, we don't see the comically obvious racial misunderstandings like you would see from some old lady trying to read the menu at a Chipotle. And you know, it's kind of the easy and reductive thing to take a look at a character like Ryder, who is almost always seen smoking a blunt, or a character like Caesar, who drives a lowrider, and to say that it's without a doubt racist. Look, I see all of that. However, I personally think this game really does a pretty damn good job of discussing these topics in a somewhat nuanced way that is there for the people who really want to dig in and analyze this stuff, like nerds on the internet like myself, but it's also mostly things that are happening in the background or aren't immediately present. Kinda like racism in the real world, huh? There are undertones to these interactions, and to those who might not be familiar with spotting them, or just not very interested in discussing the topic, they are incredibly easy to ignore, and I think for a game that is trying to be as wide of an appeal as GTA is, that is a smart and mature thing to do. And if I accidentally gave the impression that this game was nothing but gripping commentary on the sociological landscape of gang warfare in the southern part of California from the 90s, let me restate, everything here is very subtly done, and you really only notice it if you're familiar with these types of stories, or you take a step back to actually analyze what's going on under the hood. No pun intended. The game, for probably 95% of the time, is doing its best to make you laugh and entertain you. And you know what? It does a really good job of that. The tone set here in San Andreas has essentially in many ways become the perfection of their writing style, mixing drama and some serious topic discussion in a framework that is told through something that is primarily all comedic focused. There are so many interactions that have me laughing to myself, like when CJ is telling his plan to invade another casino when other people keep talking over him.
Hey, speak up! We can't hear you back here!
I appreciate your input, but please, fuck off.
What'd he say?
He said fuck off. Come on, let's get out of here.
Hey, what are you still doing here?
I live here.
Oh, okay, you can stay.
Great.
Or how about all the interactions playing up Woozy's blindness?
What's wrong? You lost? You need a hand?
No. I was just, getting the feel of the place. Stick close.
They really take that joke and run it every way you possibly can, and it hits pretty much every time. San Andreas' story, man, it just hits all the right notes for me. I'm a big fan of the comedy in this game, and I think the characters are probably Rockstar's overall strongest cast. And, like I said, there's enough meat in the themes and ideas running through this game that can really make pretentious nerds like me overanalyze a ton of shit. You might think that I may have looked a little bit too far into this game and pulled out some of my own conclusions, and maybe there is some truth to that. To me, since Rockstar has gone on record to say that gang films such as Boys in the Hood were inspirations, and since their later games started to have some more interesting social commentary like Red Dead Redemption and GTA 5, I'm inclined to believe that most of what they did here was intentional. I had fun with Vice City's story, but honestly, nothing in that game even compares with what San Andreas brought to the table. Everything was expanded upon, and the story was given damn near double the runtime to let everything cook. And the fruits from that labor are what I believe is probably the best story that this series has ever told. The really wild thing is, look at this video length. I've talked all this time about the story and presentation, and I haven't even gotten to the gameplay yet. Which, by the way, is pretty damn fantastic too. As I said in my last GTA video, link up top, the changes from 3 to Vice City's gameplay were kind of incremental. Definitely overall better for sure, but it was more of a refinement of what worked more than anything else. Well, if Vice City was just the same as GTA 3's cake with some added icing, then San Andreas is Bobby the Cake Boss coming in, tossing that cake out and making a new one. And then the Definitive Edition remasters are like putting fondant on a cake, since most people really hate fondant. Like and subscribe for more poorly thought out food comparisons. I know what the people are really here for. Point is, pretty much anything that could be improved with Vice City was for San Andreas. You still obviously have the third-person perspective antics that you were probably familiar with by now, with the shooting, driving, and exploring and all that, but now everything has been updated to be even greater than before. Let's start with some of the basic stuff like CJ's movement. For the most part, everything is pretty one-to-one with Vice City, except for 3 things, being that you can mantle, swim, and move while crouching. Now the mantling is honestly so nice. Now when you're running from the cops or trying to get to a higher vantage point, you can properly climb up ledges and such. Situational, yeah, but boy was I glad to see it added. Then there is the swimming, which, you know, is fine. Honestly, it's a little bit on the slow side, and you don't have a ton of breath when going underwater, so the biggest bonus is to just not instantly die by walking into it, and the fact that technically nothing is walled off from the player now. Now for the movement while crouching. This can be used to better position yourself for cover and sneak up behind enemies quietly during stealth sections. Yeah, you heard me right, there's stealth in this game now. It's pretty basic as there's no real way to manipulate enemy AI, but it's nice to have another option, I guess. You can even use some weapons such as the knife to perform instant takedowns. Speaking of which, melee combat saw a big improvement. There are actual combos and different moves you can do this time around, which admittedly, I didn't use a ton of since I found that shooting was always a better option. I mean, just as this guy who challenged me to a duel with a katana. Yeah, don't bring a sword to a gunfight, buddy. The shooting has definitely seen some pretty solid improvements too. Now, I know this is the definitive edition, and the lock-on was at least somewhat standardized for all 3 of the games, but I found myself able to switch to different targets far easier in this game than I did with 3 or Vice City. It's definitely not perfect, in fact, I will say it's still on the clunky side of things, but is easily the most comfortable combat system that we've seen so far. Plus, there are a ton of different weapons in this game. Pretty much everything you can think of from the previous 2 games find their way back here. But you also have the heat-seeking rockets, a silenced pistol, tear gas, a can of spray paint. Hell, you can even get a giant-ass dildo. And here I was thinking the first instance of a weaponized sex toy was in Saints Row 4. That series really did take everything from GTA, didn't it? Of course, the other side of the coin of GTA's gameplay is the driving, and this game has finally nailed it. The weight of the cars, how durable they are, the controls and all the different maneuvers you can do, them having different forms of control based on elevation and terrain, everything. There are over 180 vehicles in this game, and most of them are pretty damn unique from one another. Of course, you still have all the motorcycles, utility vehicles, RC cars, boats, airplanes, tanks, and helicopters from before, but now you also have some more interesting additions, like bicycles, construction trucks, tractors, military helicopters, jets, trucks with detachable trailers, tow trucks, trains, and even a jetpack. There are even a bunch of driving schools to show you all the different maneuvers that you can pull off within these vehicles. For a lot of the ground vehicles, you can also pull them into shops and customize them. Yeah, you can actually change the paint job, the rims, interior, add a turbo. There are a pretty damn good amount of options here. I just wish that the game didn't randomly despawn my cars after completing missions, since I would like to utilize that system more, but hey, you know, if you got the money to blow in this game, there's at least always an option to do this. Now, one of the more interesting things that San Andreas brings to the table was something that I didn't honestly expect, and that's some RPG light and social sim systems. Nearly everything you do, such as driving, holding your breath, sprinting, and shooting, they all progressively get better as you get experience using those skills. I remember the first time that I saw this system was when I first played GTA 5 a long time ago, and it looks like San Andreas was the first one to actually introduce that idea to GTA. I like this a lot. It definitely makes CJ seem a lot more powerful as the game progresses along. Though I will say, I didn't like that there was one mission that required CJ to have a certain breath level before he could do it, since I had to grind for that. And I don't really think every single gun needs to have its own XP bar, and maybe they could have just been all filed under one or one subtype, but it's still an overall good system. Some of these bars, such as muscle, fat, sex appeal, and respect, are all on the more social sim and character building side of things. Yeah, if you go to the gym and work out a bunch, CJ will become more buff. Or if you make a trip down to the pizza place and basically copy Big Smoke's order ×3, you can have CJ waddling out at a much higher weight. These can all affect CJ's appearance, and there also exist dozens of different barber and tattoo shops, as well as clothing stores that you can go to. Each of these have their own selections to make, and you can really dress CJ up in whichever way you want, which is much better than just having to go to a random spot on the map and pick up the outfit like there was in Vice City. One of the other skills I mentioned was sex appeal, and I know your 14-year-old brain probably latched onto that and is curious about how that works. Well, you horny little bastards, let me explain. So there are 6 different women that CJ can actually date in this game. Every once in a while, they'll have a beacon outside of their house, or will give CJ a call, meaning that they want to go on a date. What's kind of cool about this is each one of them have particular places that they like to go on a date, areas of the city that they like driving through, and even some certain activities such as letting the girlfriend drive, or committing drive-bys? Assuming you max out your affinity with a particular girl, I think you can probably guess what your reward is. Yep, that's right. You get an exclusive outfit. Oh yeah, sex too, I suppose. Finally, there is the respect system, which sounds a little bit more in depth than what it actually is. It essentially does some very minor things like change NPC dialogue slightly, but the big thing is being able to recruit more NPC followers from your gang that can help you fight off other gang members. They aren't the smartest group of people in the world, but hey, you get a squad of 4 or more of them, and you can seriously put a ton of bullets down range. Speaking of NPCs, the AI has seen a pretty big improvement here too. Well, it's not perfect, but it's most certainly better. The main difference here is NPCs being a lot more reactive to what is going on around them. For instance, if a crime is being committed by someone other than the player, police officers will now actually do something about it. Other than that, cops and other enemies are pretty much the same as ever. No, most of the differences that you're actually going to find are how some of the more passive NPCs react to CJ. Now, if you wail mercilessly on an NPC in the streets, some of the other ones may come up and try to attack you. Or if you get into a traffic accident, sometimes the other drivers will get road rage and either get out of their car to try to shoot you, or slam your car off the road. Yeah, there's a ton of new shit this time around. There's some things that still really aren't amazing, like the melee combat and the shooting, and the RPG systems are a little all over the place, and the AI is still kind of rock stupid for the most part, and not having your cars properly be able to save sucks. But what a massive step up this is in nearly every other regard, especially the driving. This feels like they finally hit the perfect balance this time around, and even if this was the only improvement that they made, I still would have been more than satisfied. It's thanks to all of these features that harmonize together that we were able to experience what an awesome map San Andreas is, which, yeah, let's talk about that real quick. Keep it in mind that at the time of this video, I have not played much of GTA 4 or any of the portable series, and GTA 6 has yet to be released. But I feel pretty confident in saying that Grand Theft Auto San Andreas has my absolute favorite map that the franchise has produced so far. The jump from Vice City to San Andreas when it comes to its open world is absolutely insane in my opinion. San Andreas is roughly 5 to 6 times the size of Vice City. 5 to 6 times. That is ridiculous. It's so big, in fact, that you could realistically fit the entirety of Vice City's map into just one of the cities that San Andreas has to offer. That's right, there's 3 cities this go around. We have Los Santos based on Los Angeles, San Fierro based on San Diego, and finally Las Venturas based on Las Vegas. Each of these locations have their own specific architecture that anyone playing through these areas could easily connect with their real-world counterparts. The disparity of wealth in Los Angeles, the steep streets and magnificent bridges of San Diego, and the bright neon signs and massive eye-catching hotels of Las Vegas. I personally love this approach, and while both Liberty City and Vice City were some great settings, having the amount of variety with the trifecta in San Andreas really keeps things fresh. I honestly have a really hard time picking between these 3 as to which one of them is my favorite because they all have things to really like about them. Los Santos is easily the biggest of the 3, being occupied by the majority of the gangs in this game, having the massive downtown sections and areas like Vinewood with gigantic mansions. Plus, seeing areas such as the carnival on the pier or the huge sports arena are also big highlights. This is also the only city with a dedicated gimmick, as you have the Grove Street families able to seize different territories from rival gangs that will generate passive income over time and reduce the amount of people that are attacking you while you're passing through. San Fierro, I would say, might be my least favorite of the 3, since I don't think there's actually a ton of activities to do here that you can't find in the other 2. And there isn't really a dedicated gimmick either. I think this area looks pretty cool though, and there are a ton of different alleyways and buildings to explore. Las Venturas has everything that you could be looking for a rendition of Las Vegas. Being that the Strip is a bustling theme park of things to do, and the outside of the Strips is essentially a ghost town. As someone who has recently taken a trip out to Las Vegas, I think Rockstar did a fantastic job of really capturing the vibe here, especially when it comes to the surrounding neighborhoods that most people don't really think about when they hear about Las Vegas. Each of these towns are placed in different corners of the map, so going from city to city is a bit of a trek as it takes several minutes even with a fast vehicle traveling across the landscape of San Andreas. Assuming you're like me and didn't realize that you could actually use the airports for fast travel until you got to the end of the game. Yeah. Now, for the most part, I was taking the highways and back roads of San Andreas countryside, and by God, I was so happy to see that we have some more nature to explore this time around. I definitely understand not having any of this in Liberty City because it really wouldn't make that much sense, and I was a little disappointed we didn't get much outside of the beach in Vice City, which, as I said in that video, was pretty pointless. But San Andreas more than makes up for it. You essentially have 5 additional counties that are maybe a little bit smaller in terms of landmass than the cities, but are also dotted with their own smaller towns and points of interest for you to visit, with the primary things to look at being of the agricultural variety. You have rivers waving through the state, you have massive deserts and canyons to cross, you have the gigantic Mount Chiliad to climb, and of course, the many forests that people had wondered for years if it was possible to encounter a Sasquatch in. Yeah, that's actually kind of the beauty of these areas. They're so big and have so many different little off-the-beaten trail areas to explore, you're never quite sure what you're going to find. You can even swim down to the ocean floor in this game, which I didn't find anything down there outside of some oysters, but just knowing that there might be something down there is enough to pique my curiosity. So the map is much larger, and there seems like there's a lot more to explore, and to some, that might be a bit of a turnoff. Open world fatigue is very much a real thing. Just look at how many complaints were lauded in the more recent Assassin's Creed titles. And some people really like the smaller, more focused maps of 3 and Vice City. And you know, fair enough, that's a perfectly valid thing to not enjoy. But I think San Andreas map does a pretty good job of feeling a lot bigger than it actually is. In the previous 2 games, you could pretty much get from one end of the map to the other in about 3 minutes tops, probably less with the right vehicle. San Andreas feels like a massive area to explore, until you get further into the game and have a bunch more ways of traversing, such as faster cars, vehicles capable of flight, or fast travel. All of a sudden, the map flows in a way around the player that makes getting from point A to point B far easier than originally thought. This is good because as you progress through the game, initially there are many points where the game doesn't really want you to go to certain areas, with their main deterrent being that it's just going to take a while to get there. By the end though, when you pretty much are just wrapping up side quests or getting collectibles, San Andreas gives you a lot of options to move around the world freely, which just adds to the progression a bit. Before making that ultimate transition into talking about the progression and the missions in San Andreas, I just want to say it one more time that I can't express how much fun I had just driving around the landscapes of Los Santos, Las Venturas, and San Fierro. They took the 3-act structure that we saw all the way back in GTA 1 and perfected it here, allowing players to go wherever they want provided they are willing to make the journey, having each of these areas be radically different from one another. Hell, I didn't even talk about all the different pieces of properties that you could buy like in Vice City. Yeah, there are houses everywhere that you can spend money on, which I mean, I wish they looked a little bit more distinct from one another, or if you were able to fast travel them, that'd be even better, but hey, they're just another option for you as you make your living in San Andreas. The last major point I want to touch on is the mission design in this game. So you remember my last video how I praised certain missions for like the bank heist for having multiple different steps that either had a shifting objective or a complication to make things interesting, all while having the game's colorful NPCs accompany you to add more character building? Well, pretty much every single mission in San Andreas takes that trend and runs with it to make it the status quo. The missions in this game absolutely kick ass. And there is so much variety, and they're so focused on making these memorable moments and set pieces. You really have to experience them for yourself to really understand how much of an upgrade this really is. There are so many, and I mean so many missions to do, and each of them is absolutely awesome. You have the simple stuff like breaking into a mansion and using stealth to steal a rapper's rhyme book. You have the mission where you need to ride a motorcycle up the back of an airplane. The mission where you actually go back to Liberty City, yeah, that was a fucking cool one. Way to cap off the PS2 trilogy, right? How many missions are there that literally only have one mechanic or gameplay segment that pops up that is surprisingly robust, only for it to never come back again? Like the box throwing minigame, or the first-person shooting gallery, or the mission where you have to lift things on an RC helicopter. Alright, that last one really isn't that great. But there are just so many missions like that in this game that I can't possibly sit here and tell you what I think about every single one of them. But by God, for the most part, they're pretty amazing. Emphasis on for the most part. There are a couple of missions in this game that, I'm not gonna lie, flat out fucking suck. Not that they aren't cool concepts, but there's just one thing or another that makes these missions way worse than they need to be. And you know, I'm not talking about wrong side of the tracks, surprisingly. I honestly didn't have any trouble with this one. As long as you don't run into the train or crash, Big Smoke was able to kill all the goons just fine. And the flight school missions didn't really suck for me either, as I think the flight controls in this game are just fine for the planes and the helicopters. Not for the RC plane though. The mission supply lines can go fuck itself. You have to kill all these goons around the middle of San Fierro using a shitty RC plane that controls like absolute shit, and it just blows. I died right before the last enemy was killed multiple times. Oh, and then when they told me that I had to fly back after I finally was able to kill it, my hands started sweating with how nervous I was if I ended up crashing again. Seriously, fuck this mission. I also didn't like the few times I was locked out of progressing through certain missions because I either didn't have my breath leveled up enough, or relationship status with a particular girlfriend to an appropriate amount. That just felt like it was there to pad out and waste my time. And I know now I could have worn the gimp suit for the particular girlfriend to bypass this, which I didn't know at first, or I could have gotten all the oysters to max out my breath, which I really didn't want to do. Though I did have trouble with one other mission, one that I never really hear people complain about. Black Project. Alright, so positive real quick. Since most of the missions in San Andreas are much longer than the previous two games, that means the Definitive Edition has more frequent checkpoints rather than starting the mission over. Helpful, right? Well, usually yeah, since it's typically me just making a dumb mistake that can be easily correctable in my next attempt. Here's the predicament that I found myself with on this mission though. So the setup is cool. You fight your way through a restricted military base, swarming with soldiers in an attempt to steal a top secret piece of equipment, which is revealed to be a jetpack. After retrieving the jetpack, you are expected to fly out of the facility and bring it back to the airstrip that you've been performing jobs out of. So I attempt to fly out of the base and get gunned down by soldiers. I reload. I attempt to fly out of the base and am immediately shot midair. I reload. This is when I notice that my health does not refill upon respawning at a checkpoint. I looked everywhere around this area for some extra health or armor, but the doors to the previous parts of the level were actually sealed off, preventing me from going to do that. So I think to myself, okay, maybe I can just kill the guards up top before trying to fly away. Well, I don't think the secret government project of this base was actually the jetpack. No, I think the secret was that they're actually making fucking clones of American Sniper Chris Kyle, because the second that I stick more than an inch of my head out of the hatch of the base, it becomes a fucking premonition of what Rockstar would do at the end of Red Dead Redemption 1. I spent probably a solid hour doing this, which fucking sucks because the only weapon that you can use while in the jetpack is the shitty little MAC-10, and the controls on the jetpack also fucking suck too. Like, you need to make sure that you are carrying your momentum, or else you would just float around like a dumbass in midair, going absolutely nowhere. Eventually, I had to just sort of prairie dog my head just enough outside of the hatch so I could shoot them, but they couldn't get me. And even then, they would still fire back after my first shot. This meant I really only had 1 to 2 shots to kill most of these guys, and just when I think I had got them all, boom, shot by some fucking camper behind a bush. I'm starting to get flashbacks to Modern Warfare 2019. I did this over and over again, and I had to start blind firing in this bush to hopefully kill this guy before he got me, which basically never worked. But then, all of a sudden, I got lucky. I was able to position myself behind this search post, and I could see where this piece of shit was shooting me from. I inched myself closer around the corner, aimed at his head, and oh my god, I did it. Oh, thank fucking god, I never have to do this shit again. And all I have to do is fly out of here and finish this stupid fucking mission. This mission fucking sucks. Why the fuck can't my health regen after I respawn? Why the fuck did the jetpack controls feel like they were programmed when one of the devs was drunk? Why are these guys so fucking accurate with their guns? Oh, they buffed NPC accuracy in the Definitive Edition. Pick your poison here. You're either having a hard time with wrong side of the tracks in the original, or you're going to get bent over on this mission with the remaster. Dealer's choice, either way, you're fucked. Let's lighten the mood back up a little bit, because outside of that extremely bullshit scenario, San Andreas was still easily the most fun that I've had with any of these games in regards to its mission structure. The game has a lot more of these linear combat sections that'll become more and more commonplace as games such as Gears of War would revolutionize third-person shooting just a couple of years later. These missions typically have extra weapons, armor, and health stored away in areas to allow for more waves of enemies to be thrown at the player to make these sections more exciting. And with this stupid shit, you'll definitely need all of that. Some of these levels even have you have different ways of giving you health, such as buying a snack from the vending machine or just hooking up with random women. What? Old video games are something, man, let me tell you. I think some of the best parts about the missions in these games are the rewards that you get after completing them. You still get a decent chunk of cash and some respect XP like you'd expect, but now some missions will even give you some bonus rewards available to you in the open world. These include different places to live, having some extra perks, having places give the player a passive income, having certain areas of the map have guaranteed vehicle spawns, which is really awesome for some areas such as the airstrip, since you can basically turn those hangars into your own personal armada. Hell, there are even some missions that will unlock you some extra side activities. And how many side activities there are, holy shit. Outside of like Final Fantasy or Yakuza, or I guess a Mario Party game if you want to get all technical about this, I have not seen a game from this time have so many different side activities or minigames. You've got street racing, burglary, chasing down couriers that are selling cocaine, betting on horse races, missions where you're a trucker that needs to haul things to a particular area, missions in the quarry. You can go play basketball or pool, even though I can never figure out how to actually control these properly. You have like 4 different arcade games, lifting weights, delivering groceries, all the different gambling minigames, which I think there's like 5 of them. The fucking rhythm minigames for dancing or using the hydraulics for your lowrider. The vigilante justice missions, taxi missions, ambulance and fire truck emergencies. You can even be a fucking pimp in this game if you want. These aren't all winners, but most of them are pretty damn good, surprisingly. Not to mention all the collectibles and the tags in Los Santos display. There is just an insane amount of content to do in San Andreas. This is a really surprising thing to see here, not just because there's not a crazy amount of stuff in the earlier games, but also because there really isn't that much in the later ones. How cool would it be if in GTA 5 you could go do some of the rhythm minigames, like having Franklin go to the strip club? Or how about just the small stuff like delivering people groceries? Like, imagine Trevor being your ship driver or something. That shit writes itself. Or how come there's no gambling in the casino in GTA 5? Well, actually, seeing as how Rockstar introduced the shark card system, maybe that's for the best. The amount that there is to do in San Andreas is just simply remarkable. I easily doubled my playtime going from Vice City to San Andreas, and honestly, I could probably even triple this if I was going for a completionist run. There is just a lot of game here, and even if not all of it is amazing, just the fact that the majority of it is really makes playing through San Andreas an experience I won't soon forget. Man, what an absolutely marvelous time I had playing through this game. Outside of the OST, I honestly can't think of anything that San Andreas didn't improve on from Vice City. The animations and cinematography are way, way better. The story was given a much larger scope, and the characters are both really funny, but also speak to themes far greater than themselves. The gameplay was just a massive upgrade from what we had previously in every regard, and has almost reached perfection in a number of areas. The open world, in my opinion, is easily the best in the series, and the mission design has some of the most variety and awesome set pieces an action game can provide. So with all that being said, does San Andreas manage to get to that upper echelon of games for me, such as Bloodborne, Portal 2, and Outer Wilds, as being some of my all-time favorites? Well, not quite. There are a couple of things holding this game back. Like I said, the shooting is still a bit on the clumsy side, even if it was updated in the remaster. The 2 sections where I had to grind to progress really sucked, and not gonna lie to you guys, I'm still kind of bitter about that jetpack mission. Those are mostly minor complaints though. San Andreas is an absolutely amazing game, and one that I wholeheartedly recommend. Personally, I'd say emulate the PS2 version if at all possible, since you can always mod the game with some extra modern fixings, but if you don't want to mess with that stuff, the Definitive Edition is still an okay way to experience the game, even if there are a couple of things that were fucked up along the way. Give it a try if you never played it before, or replay it if it's been a minute. This game has made me really excited for what's to come. That's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.